So today we'll be looking at how I created this look here, all the different nodes that I used, a little bit of my thought process while building it. And if you like this and you would like project files, they'll also be available through the channel membership, so you can take a look at that. But without further ado, let's get started. Explore a wide selection of pre-made creative tools for DaVinci Resolve, like titles, transitions, slideshows and infographics, like bar charts and callouts, and much, much more. Link in the description for more information. Now, since this is all built in Fusion, the first thing you're going to want to do is make a Fusion comp. If you don't know how to do that, we'll just right click, new Fusion comp, add one into your project, say how long you want it to be, drag it onto the timeline, and then we can jump right into Fusion. So we'll go right over into Fusion now, and I'll show you the nodes that I have here. It's not a super complicated node tree here, but I'll kind of go over it a little bit. So it starts off with the actual text that we have here, and this is just a text node. So if you just hold down shift and hit spacebar, you can type in here text, and you're going to be grabbing the text plus tool. So that's what we're going to be using here first. And then the font that I chose here, I actually got off of Google Fonts, so you have the ability to go and get that. The primary thing you're going to want to look for here in a font is a font that kind of strings everything together. You get like the best results out of that. You can use a different font, but you know, the look that you're going for might be a little bit different. So the next thing that I did is I pulled in a B-spline, which is this little guy right here. You just pull that in, and all we're going to do with this is we're just going to start making the spline follow this as if I was writing this, right? So we're going to go around, and we'll bring it back down and around. The difference between these two is if we see a B-spline, what it's going to do is it's going to make, you can see this red line here is it goes up and then it comes back down, compared to if I was to use a polyline, every point that I make, it's going to be sharp on that point, right? If I was to, let's grab another one of these so I can show you in contrast. If I go around, you can see that even though I made the point up here, it's kind of wrapping around to get a nice curve. And because this is kind of like cursive, that's why we went with that. So if I bring this back up here and I bring this in, there is our line. If we just take a look at our line here, actually, let's look at it like this. So I'm just looking at this, but I'm clicking on this because then I can see all the controls for that node instead of actually seeing that node. So you can see here, if I actually come to the end, we can see that it just comes down. And there was a couple of things that I noticed. Once we get into building this, I'll kind of go over it a little bit more, but I ended up having to, instead of just starting it here, starting it outside of the letter and then bringing it in, made it a little bit better. And you can see that these kind of start in the middle, but then we have a couple of these that go on the outside a little bit, and that's just kind of to get that blob to kind of flow a little bit better. And then because this is going in as a mask, what's going to happen is if I come to the beginning here, if we look at this, that's where I'm starting. And what I ended up doing is I took the position and I just made the position 0, right? And then the line length itself, we started at 0. And then once we get up to the end, well, all it is a single line, and the line just kind of fills in everything until it gets to here, which then it goes to a 1. So those are the only keyframes that control this whole thing. So it just goes and it fills in, and because it's a mask, what it's doing is it's then revealing the text. So if we look at these side by side, what you'll see is this is a big blob, but we're just revealing the text that's that it's attached to. So then we get the crisp letters instead of, you know, what we have going on here. So that's how I did the reveal for the text itself. What's pretty cool too is then when we come down to the actual, that blob itself, I ended up using particles, and I'll dive into the particles a little bit. But one thing that's really cool to see here is that if we look at this, this is the same exact line that I have here. If we take a look at both of these lines when I'm jumping back and forth, the line is identical, right? It's just the look is a little bit different. And the only thing that changed between these two is if I look at this lower one here that's in the emitter, is that instead of using, we just flipped which one we're using. So we have the line length, and I initially had this at 0, so then it's just a little circle, and it worked good, but I found that if I used the little line, that it helped out a little bit better, and it had better results. But the same exact timing here, so starting at 0, we have it at 0, and then once we get to frame 100, now this depends on the frame rate in which you're using, but I determined that at 100 I wanted it to then stop the animation and then just kind of be static, and I'll explain why here in a second. But so we're just switching the difference between these. So I before had the length at 0, and then the position just went from 0 to 1 at frame 100, and this one up here that's doing the text itself, it's just the opposite way around. So the big thing to note with these is you pretty much want to make the masks identical. And if you change them, you just change them very slightly from one another, or you just update both of them. If I come into my particles, if you've never used a particle system, right here are some of the particle stuff. You can also right click and go into tools, and then we have particles here and all the particle stuff here. So the first thing you're going to grab is an emitter, and then the next thing you have to grab is a renderer. So you might have a particle system, and that can be 2D or 3D, but then you need to have a renderer that then takes that scene and then it pushes it to 2D or into a 3D scene. But so we first start with this emitter, and as you can see, this emitter has 2 connectors, and this emitter currently has none. The reason why is because if I come over to the region, it starts off as this as a region, right? And then if I was to, let's increase the amount that this would, I just got to connect these up quick so we can see this. As time goes on, what it's doing is it's saying, okay, however, this is, I'm under the emitter settings here, every frame it's going to spawn 50 particles, and then down here the lifespan, each particle will last for 100 frames, right? So those are numbers that you kind of have to work together, and then here in a second I'll show you the others, but let's just work on just the region. So the region typically would start with this, and now you could, as you can see over here, my actual, let's get the text up here. If I view that, right, what you could do is you could say, okay, well, I'm just going to have this map out, right, and then create my blob. Or what you can do is you can come into here and you can go to use bitmap, and that will add a connector in. And then what that's going to do is it will then use just this little area here to spawn particles, right? So now if I look at this, we can see, like, okay, we start up here and now we're spawning particles. There's a couple other things for our particles to look like this, but so now you can see that the emitter aspect, like the region aspect, we're following just where it's lit up. That's the only spot that particular frame 9, can spawn particles right there. But remember, all of these back here are all alive because we have a lifespan. So if I come into here, my lifespan is 10 frames, right? So frame 1 will spawn those pixels, or excuse me, those particles will be around for 10 frames. Now you can do an additional thing with those is if we come into the actual style of the particles, the other thing that I changed here is particle over life. Or the size over life. So we say that, okay, it's going to stay at its normal size, but then as its life goes on, so by the time it gets to the 10th frame, the size just gets significantly smaller. And as you can see, the sizes of them are going to get a little smaller. Actually, let me show you this. If I turn this off, we can see this a little bit better here once these come in here. Hello? No, I didn't move it down. Okay, so here we can see it a little bit better. So we started off with particles, right? They're all normal size, but as the life goes on for those particles, they're just getting smaller, right? And now it has nothing else. That's all that we have currently going on. So if I just look at that, that's all we have going on, right? The other thing too that I didn't really say here is that if I come into the actual particles themselves, what style do we want them to be in? And if you come down to bitmap, it'll add on another connector, so then we can add something else in. And I added in an ellipse, which then allows me to change the size of these particles to whatever we want, right? And then it also allows me to change the softening there as well. So I don't even remember what I had these at, but I think it was something like this maybe. Okay, that's too small. Now let's see if I can go back enough to... Okay, so there we go. All right, so and then I added in like the softening and stuff like that. So we have just this, but then we use that as a particle. So that's pretty much all I did on the particles themselves. The only thing they do is they just change. I did change the amount, or when they actually come in, the distribution of them. So I just had it set to randomly. And I think everything else, oh, the other thing too is here on frame 0, I didn't want this little portion to spawn. So once everything starts to move, I then have it go from the amount that it spawns for frame 0 is going to be 0, but then frame 1 it jumps up to 30, and then it stays as 30. And then here, once it gets to the end of that animation, we take a look at here. Once it gets to the end of that animation, I then have it it stops spawning here, right? So then they just last 10 more frames and then they all disappear, right? Because that size over time or over life. So then that just comes out to the renderer. So now if we take a look at that, that's all we have going on so far. And I was like, okay, that looks all right, but now I want to add in a, here, let me show you how it initially looked. So here is what we have going on now. I changed a couple of things when it comes into this background here. If we come over to here, I changed this to the alpha of it, so that's how much is transparent, and I changed the mapping of this as well because they're really soft. I just wanted to change the I wanted it to not be like subtle dots. I want it to be bigger, so I just changed my mapping of 1 to 0, and I just moved it down. So anything above this number, all of this was a variant of 1 all the way up to 1, but now all of that is going to be a 1, and then everything below this is just going to be a 0. And then there's a mapping in between, and because they're both the same number, there is no in between with mapping. So at first it started out looking like that, and I was like, okay, that looks all right, and that would work for, you know, if you're going for like paint splatter sort of a look, that might work. But then I was like, okay, I want to add on a little bit of a blur on the already blurred particles. So then I ended up with like this sort of thing, and I was like, okay, that's looking good, but if you increase the blur too much, it doesn't really do the right thing. So we have this blurry painting already. What if we blur on top of that the blurry, you know, the blurry bits that we have already? And then that led us to where we are now, where it's just this blob, and we get this tail because they're all getting smaller in size. And then the faster it moves in certain areas, changes the density of all of the particles with all the blurred being added. So the faster it moves, the more of a tail it gets. So we get that, and then we get this kind of like little thing, and I thought that that's the look that I was going for. So my first one, I come in at 11 with the blur, and then I go all the way up to a 36 blur, and then that comes into here, which then I can change the color. And this looks all right, but then I was like, I want this to stand out from the text itself. So that's when I just come in and you just type in shadow, and then I get this shadow, not this first one, but this second shadow here. I use that because it's a very simple shadow, and all you do is you just change the offset just a little bit, and then we get this little edge that's below it now. So now that will stand out from the actual text that I have here. And there's a couple of things that I did with the text too. So this is how it started to look, right? So now we have them both timed the same amount, because remember we had the spline here, we had this length that was increasing, and then over here, instead of the length, we had the position changing, right? So that's over time. So they're currently timed the exact same amount. I was like, all right, that looks good. But then there was something else that I wanted to do, and I wanted to do like a mask around the outside of the text. And there is a very simple way of, here, let me just copy this and show you this quick. There is a very simple way to get like a line on the outside, right? And you could come over here to styling, and if we add in another styling, well, this one's already defaulted as a red outline, we could do that, right? But if we come into here and we turn off this, you know, so we just have that outline, what you'll see is that it comes inside, right? And I was like, okay, well, I could make a custom mask and mask that, or I could take that a step further and I could have my text and then use an edge detect, right, which will detect the edge, and then I can put a color on that detect. But then we have this whole inside that's now a color. Now there are some stuff that you can come into here, and then you could do this so that you get the color from the primary node that you were using, right? You could do that, or what you could do is you could just use a Boolean. So you have one image that comes in, and then you take the other image and you use that as a subtract. So you subtract the text itself, so then you only get the outline. So now I don't have those like little bits that are inside. So I had that, right? And then there was one other thing that I really didn't like, and that how it's like color difference like this. And when you look at it from a distance on a solid, it almost looks like a embossed, I think it's what it's called. It had like that kind of a look, because that's what you would do. You would have one side in shadow, one side in light. That's why you have one dark and one light, and that's how you get that look. And I was like, I don't really like that, so I fed that in as a mask to a solid, and now it's just a solid color that will come up. So I did that, and that looked all right. So if I then add the text in there, right? Because the text is going to come in here. If we look at this, the text is going to come in with that spline that we added in, right? So we have that gets added in. But one thing that you'll notice is, you probably didn't notice this up until this point, but it gets kind of sloppy with how we brought everything in, and that outline really shows off that sloppiness. So this looked all right. I kind of liked how this was looking. It looked all right. But I just really didn't like the whole like outline bit, because as you can see here, we didn't do that. Now you could go in and fix this all up, but after time I was like, I really don't like that, so I just kind of went without it, and I thought that this ended up looking pretty cool. And then over time, the more and more I then added a background, and I'll show you how to do the background in a second. But the more and more I was adding this on, I was like, okay, that looks really clean, but how would that look if I added in a shadow to this particular text as well? So then I added that in, and I was like, okay, I think that really makes it look even better. So that's kind of what I went with for this background here. As you can tell, it's not one solid color. All you do is you just go to gradient, you pick your colors, because it'll give you this little line to pick the color. Here, I'll just make one here for you. So we have this, we go into gradient, right? And now you can pick the kind, but I did radial, so we just pick like the middle. So this is just 0.5 to get the middle, and then you can just move this line to wherever you want to get the thing. And then you just pick a color. So what do you want your inside color to be? Let's say I wanted it to be that color, and then your outside color, and I just went to make it a little lighter, right? So maybe something like that. Or you could flip them around and go the other way, so the inside was the lighter bit and then the outside, so something like that. And I'd probably bring this back and get a little bit more color out of there, but yeah, so that's pretty much what I did there. So I just wanted to show you how you could take a couple of nodes that make a particle system of a bunch of dots, and you can turn that into a blob that, depending on how fast it's moving, would reduce its density, which then kind of makes it resemble a blob moving really quick, because then it gets the tail and all. But yeah, that's kind of all I got for you for this one. Let me know what you guys think of this style of videos. And with that being said, my name's JR. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.